Welcome to the Coretex webinars, which are a series of property and facilities-related presentations by experts from the property and facilities industry. I'm Steve Dunavine. I've had over 20 years' experience in the property industry, and I've held senior positions in both the public and private sectors, on the client and supplier sides, and I have advised many well-known organisations on a whole range of property-related issues. And these organisations include Cadbury Schweppes, Microsoft, and the Home Office. This webinar was first broadcast live on Tuesday the 26th of March 2013. This recorded version is presented as a voice and slideshow broadcast. This webinar is an introduction in how to create a property strategy. During my career, I've been involved in creating many property strategies for private and public sector organisations, and today I want to introduce you to the fundamentals for creating a property strategy. I'm going to start by looking at what we mean by a property strategy and why it's important, and then I'm going to introduce you to the basic processes involved in creating one. So what do we mean by a corporate property strategy? I'm sure there are many different definitions, but here's potentially one. In this context, we're essentially talking about creating a plan of action to maximise the total value of an organisation's property assets. Essentially, we're talking about gathering and analysing data so that we can create a property plan. In this plan, we're going to create a series of options for using an organisation's property in a way that best supports its core objectives. So why then a strategic plan for property? Why not just a straightforward property maintenance plan, for instance? The answer to that can be found in management theory. The real value of corporate real estate is the sum of its contribution to an organisation's operational effectiveness and also its competitive advantage. So what we're saying here really is that real estate can be much more valuable to an organisation than the sum of its parts, and more valuable than an organisation's executives often realise. What management theory tells us is that an organisation's reason for being is to create a profit or a shareholder value, or if you're in the public sector, to create public good. In each case, to achieve this, it needs to maximise the use of all its assets. And these assets include people, technology, information, capital, and, as often referred to, the fifth resource, real estate, or property if you prefer. But unless your organisation enjoys a perfect monopoly, it will find itself in competition with others trying to do a similar thing, and therefore it needs a strategy that's hard to copy. These days, most organisations strive to use their assets efficiently, and this is known as operational effectiveness. But operational effectiveness can be easily copied. So to be more successful than the competition, an organisation needs to find a unique and sustainable way of using all its assets, which are hard to copy. And this is known as creating a sustainable competitive advantage. And so when it comes to an organisation's fifth resource, its land and buildings, the role of the property expert is to devise a property strategy for using property assets in a way that contributes to both operational effectiveness and creating and maintaining a competitive advantage. Think of strategy as a continuum. On the left-hand side here, you'll see what we refer to as the hygiene factors. This is both in a literal and a metaphoric sense. So this could refer, say, to creating your basic maintenance plan that ensures property is in good functioning order, that compliance issues are met, that its services run smoothly, roof tiles are mended, etc. And this will contribute to your organisation's day-to-day operational effectiveness. But real estate in this bracket is probably seen as little more than a utility and probably much more as a cost. But as the approach to property becomes more strategic, more aligned with your organisation's core objectives, it becomes more valuable to the organisation and harder, therefore, for competitors to copy. So, for example, say your strategy includes an active cost reduction program or introduces a program for optimising the physical environment for staff, or your strategy looks at improving occupational flexibility to improve efficiencies, etc. In effect, property starts to help your organisation compete. And then as your strategy becomes more sophisticated still, and more specifically aligned to the direction your organisation wants to travel, ultimately your property strategy enables your organisation to enhance its competitive or unique advantage. So, for instance, this might mean identifying an optimum geographical location for occupation that, once occupied by your organisation, denies your competition access to that exact location. So a simple example would be a site for a supermarket, for instance. Or perhaps your strategic consolidation program leads to disposals, and the capital released and revenue saved is invested in core products and services. I've been involved personally in smart working programs that allows us to actually attract staff away from the competition and retain them after they join the organisation. If you're new to this subject, a great introduction to the value of real estate can be found in the Harvard Business article. It's a seminal article first published in, I think it's 1995, called Managing Real Estate to Build Value by Marlon Apgar. Also responsible, I'm told, to launching 1,000 corporate real estate careers. Worth checking out. So we've then established what a property strategy is and why it's valuable. Let's say that your organisation wants one created. How do you go about this? Firstly, you have to think about whose responsibility in an organisation it is to create a strategy. Is it your responsibility? If it is, what are you and your team trying to achieve, and who are they going to present your findings to? Let's say it's the board. What exactly do they require? What are the core organisational objectives you need to align your strategy with? Are you expected to produce a report or a presentation, and probably both, and by when? It sounds straightforward, but ensure you have clear instructions, the authority and possibly the finance or budget to undertake this project. And wherever possible, identify a sponsor who's going to support you and your strategy. Now, this sponsor is probably a board member or a councillor if in public sector, etc. Certainly a person of influence and authority, often not a property person though, although they understand the value of property and the value of property strategy. Then you need to start thinking about the range of stakeholders you'll need to engage with. These reside in various departments, business units, faculties if you're in further education, etc. We'll be looking at some of these in more detail in a moment. Let's now look at the process and look at, in the context of the wider process for creating a property strategy. If this slide doesn't appear too well on your screen, I'm going to be talking you through it. At the top, in the green box, we have agreed our overall objectives, what the program looks like, and established the roles and responsibilities of those involved. Your role is effectively about gathering information, and from which you can create an informed strategy. In its purest form, our strategy involves a plan for supplying the right property to meet the current and future demands of the organisation. So on the supply side, we're trying to establish what the organisation is currently doing with its property now, and we'll look at that in a second, and that's the red box there. Then we're going to establish what the demand for property is, and that's the blue box next. And we're trying to work out what the demand for the property is currently and in the future. This demand is not just in terms of physical space, it also includes locational demand or meeting organisational key performance indicators, which may be expressed in terms of cost, timing or CO2 reduction, but these KPIs are impacted by real estate. Our strategy requires us to compare our findings and work out what the gap, some people refer to that as the delta between what is currently being provided, supply, and what will be required, the demand. This gap analysis is more useful too if you can use benchmarks, particularly those of your current competition, if these are available. And this is where your expertise and market knowledge comes into play. Once you've gathered your data, you need to analyse it. And this analysis is then used to develop your options. These will include or this part of the exercise will include financial modelling, scenario planning, sensitivity analysis, and this is an introduction to this topic, and we'll be looking in more detail at some of these financial modelling, scenario planning, etc. in our advanced webinar on this topic. Once you've created your vision, your strategy, you'll need to present it to the board probably, or to whoever's asked for the property strategy to be created. Finally, the bottom there, if your recommendations are accepted, you can think about implementation. You'll be monitoring and reviewing the outcomes of any implementation to facilitate an ever-increasing improvement to your ongoing strategy, known as feedback loop by some. So that's an overview of the process. Now you want to prepare to meet with the functions of the organisation for undertaking consultations to reveal the data you're looking for. Who exactly are these stakeholders? Here's a good example. This one was produced by KPMG. They start with the corporate strategy at the top, and as you go clockwise, they talk about engaging stakeholders in their business units. Again, this will be your service departments in the public sector or your faculties, etc. They talk about mergers, acquisitions and disposals. They have space planning as a separate stakeholder. That may well be the case, or they might be part of the property department or similar. They then have your facilities management team, your IT, your HR, human resources and finance. All those stakeholders contributing to your real estate strategy. Might also be worth mentioning, particularly if you're in the public sector, but it's not limited to that, union engagement. You'll find that they're an important stakeholder, and it is far easier to engage earlier with unions, particularly if there's going to be an impact on workers in terms of their working environment, and if you leave it to the last moment before you're trying to implement your strategy and you haven't yet properly engaged with them. But before you rush off and start speaking with all these functions, you need to prepare for your stakeholder engagement. Once again, we have a mini process here. In what order do you want to prioritize these meetings? Starting perhaps with your corporate function. Make sure they know why and by what authority you're going to be speaking with them. Help your stakeholders by explaining in advance what data you're going to need them to bring along. No point in them turning up to your meeting saying that they have that information, they just don't have it to hand. It's a fruitless conversation. Of course, ensure that any matters of confidentiality are addressed and any concerns put to rest. When you enter into discussion then with them, make sure that you're prepared, that you have data and property knowledge to share with them that might be of interest in the conversation. Ensure that you have a means of capturing their feedback and data. That might be a straightforward pen and piece of paper, but it's more likely to be a more complicated Excel spreadsheet you might have to fill in, or some other formal feedback device. Then moving across to feedback, you have the comments and you have the data. You can start to build up a picture of demand and supply and cross-comparing data from your different consultations with different stakeholders. Be careful to ensure that before you use their comments, of course, that you have their sign-off, that you really captured indeed what they said. Be sure that that what you record tallies with what they meant. Be prepared to discuss options that you're thinking about with them. Be careful also not to promise them solutions to their problems now. It's very easy to get suckered into that conversation. You have to be very clear that this is about engagement with a wide range of stakeholders, of which there are one, and that collectively you'll be making recommendations to the board that serve the organisation as a whole. Now that you're prepared to talk to your stakeholders, they know that you're coming to talk to them, everybody has the information to hand. You're going to be asking them a series of questions effectively, and we talked about the supply and demand, so let's look at supply. And effectively, that's your current property data. Pretty straightforward stuff. Here you're trying to establish and cross-check what real estate is currently being consumed by their function. And this may be data that you already have or don't have centrally, and they may have access to or they may not, but this is your task. You're looking to populate at the very minimum a database with the address, a unique set of property identification numbers or similar, where the property is held or land is held, any lease details, of course the size. HC on this slide you'll see is headcount, so that's internal to the organisation. Are there external headcount that use facilities now and again or working from home, etc.? Workstation numbers, what currently is provided. Cost of rent, if they're paying it directly or not, what service charges there are, etc. And you get the general idea. Another one is to work out, are their buildings fit for purpose? They'll be very quick to tell you which buildings they think are not fit for purpose. And quite often I found that at this stage you find interesting things about people's reaction to real estate, including how they spend on it. It may well be a centralised budget and centralised purchasing of property services to mend broken windows and tiles, etc. But quite often you'll find that service departments circumnavigate this, and because they want to get something done now, and they end up paying a lot more for a service provided or something to be mended. All this is good information that you need to be capturing. So we've looked at the supply side current property data. Now we're going to go through the demand side. You're going to be asking a whole series of questions revolving around ultimately trying to establish the objectives, the direction, expansion or contraction of their function. With this, you, as a property person, are thinking about the impact of what they're trying to achieve and what they're telling you in terms of demand for real estate now and going forward. So, for instance, you might ask them, what are the overall objectives of the department? What does the department do, and why do they do it? Why is it important to their organisation? Do they have any KPIs? Can they be explicit about what key performance indicators they're trying to meet? Have a think about how real estate might contribute or prevent them from achieving those KPIs. Have a look at the structure of the department. Who's in it? Who's got responsibility for what decision making? You've established, probably through your supply side, what the current headcount is. Then you need to ask them whether there's going to be any changes to this in 3 years, 5 years, 10 years' time. Now, we'll talk about this probably a bit later as well, but in my experience, quite often they will claim that they won't be able to look more than about 5 months ahead. So you really have to have a serious conversation about, is that really the case? Are there no more predicting factors than that in terms of how they're growing as a function? Ask them whether they pay, and you'll probably know this if you're the real estate function, a real rent for their property. What's their attitude towards it? Do they have to actually, does it come out of their budget, or does it just feel like a free resource to them? How does real estate support their functions? Is it just somewhere to sit, or is it absolutely essential to their research and development function, or could they, if they're an IT department, do they need to be in the head office? Could they be working from home, etc., or remotely? What about any ongoing property issues or challenges? It'd probably be actually the first thing that they tell you. What's wrong? What's not working? What needs fixing? Is any of their budget put aside to spend on capital works, fit-outs or replacements, etc.? And what strategic partners do they have? We talked about external. It might be that they have a whole range of outsourced functions, consultants, etc., that do or don't use property or might use property in the future, and you want to get a good understanding of that. What about any service asset planning? I think that quite often real estate in organisations that I've visited is not high on the agenda in terms of explicit planning. So they'll be planning for increasing or decreasing the size of their function or moving geographical location, etc. But quite often they'll come to property last. One way of really getting understanding from a property perspective is to ask them if they could start their function from scratch. What would it look like in terms of property? Would they have them all in this one building, or would they have them all in these 40 buildings? What would the perfect solution be? So remember, we said this before, you're not looking to go into the solution to the problems, you're looking to understand their objectives so you can devise the optimum strategy to support them and the whole organisation through real estate. Now let's have a canter through some examples of the stakeholders you're going to be talking to. Back to our KPMG slide here, looking at corporate strategy. What you're looking for here is what are the corporate or organisational objectives? If you don't already know it off by heart, look for the organisation's vision statement and the more detailed set of organisational objectives that probably sit behind it and support this vision. These should be clearly stated and available. They're likely to be in your organisation's company statement or corporate plan, and they're probably regularly articulated by the board. I decided for this presentation to pick on an example. They're not currently a client of Coretex, but everybody's heard of Coca-Cola. So I thought, let's have a look at their mission statement and try and think about it in terms of real estate. So they start off, their mission statement is this at Coca-Cola: to refresh the world in mind, body and spirit, to inspire moments of optimism through their brands and actions, etc. There's not a lot there from a property perspective that's very explicit. And luckily, behind their mission statement, they have a Coca-Cola vision statement. And it's all the P's: profit, people, portfolio, partners, planet and productivity. And under each one of those, profit for instance, they say maximising return to shareholders, or be mindful of their overall responsibilities. Well, you can start to see that in terms of real estate, efficiency in property would eventually affect the bottom line, which helps maximise return to shareholders. People, for instance, they say being a great place to work where people are inspired to be their best, etc. Working place environment, very much a property issue, flexibility, etc. Somewhere attractive to attract and retain staff. That certainly supports that part of the vision. And so it goes on. Planet, for instance, being responsible global citizens, sustainability in property and CO2 ratings, etc. So you get the idea. Now, Coca-Cola go one step more. They have a series of objectives that support the vision that supports the mission. So their objectives appear to be to double the size of their business by 2020. And therefore they start talking about planned changes, expansion. And you then start to think about how real estate can specifically play its part in this competitive advantage, geographical changes and productivity, etc. Now, I've known property professionals undertake this exercise and comment to me that actually this is the first time they've ever really seen or really thought about the organisation's core objectives and what they're trying to achieve, because they've been too busy dealing with the day-to-day real estate issues and the day job. But let's not forget, real estate and its strategy is there to serve the organisation and not itself. Let's move on to the business units. So business units, service departments or faculties, etc. Your real estate strategy must support the current and anticipated demand of the business units, service departments or faculties. The key is likely to be flexibility. Of course, unfortunately, flexibility comes at a price. But so often we'll see a cheaper lease deal entered into only to find a couple of years down the line that department has grown and people are squashed into space, or that business unit no longer exists and you're paying for space that no longer needed. The original deal turned out to be a false economy, so working closely with your business units or departments, getting a clear understanding of their plans and strategies is key. At one local authority I worked at, I was able to convince the heads of departments to add a specific asset strategy agenda to each of their service departments' monthly capital meetings. So therefore, one of my team or I would have a seat at those meetings. Eventually, we were able to establish explicit service asset plans for each department. And these explicitly describe the future demand and supply of real estate to meet their service needs. Collectively, these service asset plans, or SAPs as we call them, informed a central corporate strategy. So I've become part of their decision-making process, not simply a service provider reacting to their demands. Importantly, look out for business units looking also to merge or acquire other businesses. And what are the implications of this? What consolidation opportunities will they be? What will you do with the new headcount? When is it all happening? That's what you can gain from stakeholder meetings with your business units. Now, alignment with FM, HR and IT. So that's why I put these three functions in blue. They're very likely to be separate departments, although FM, we might call part of your property team, but FM, HR and IT, or property, HR and IT, working closely together, is the ideal trilogy for getting things done in real estate. From an FM perspective, facilities management, FM, may or not be siloed from the property team, or it might be your role here is to engage and align yourselves with those responsible for managing or delivering facilities management. They'll need to tailor their FM delivery to exactly what is needed and enter into the right agreements with suppliers for the right length of time, etc. So details of anticipated or planned changes are essential. Poor notice may result in poor FM performance, which quickly translates to affected unhappy occupants. HR and IT, this is an interesting one. In my personal experience, I found the property department always hopes to drive real estate change, because after all, we're the property guys, yeah? But it's often IT that actually takes the lead in reality, maybe because they're the ones who've secured funding. IT seems to get a lot of funding, and perhaps they're exciting futuristic talk of how IT can power the workforce with their office reducing cloud technology. So IT can dictate what's possible in terms of real estate and dictate how much real estate is needed, or at least lead the charge. And issues that they will talk about are advancements in telephony, teleconferencing, meeting room connectivity, home working capability and technology, international connection, country capability. And all these issues will need to be factored into your strategy, probably working alongside them. So the IT's department's objectives, the remit, the capability, they all need to be fully understood. And then we've got HR, human resources. Now, in my experience here, I've found that HR is often the opposite and often largely unengaged in such matters. Property is more about people than it is bricks and mortars, I would say, or IT for that matter, but HR often has its own agenda or chooses to take only a passive role. I don't know why, but perhaps they fear issues around confidentiality, or the property is a technical issue and they don't have much to add. Of course, in reality, HR is absolutely essential. They're the ones tasked with writing the policies to help attract and retain staff, including the physical conditions, the working environments. They'll know about cafeteria services, headcount, gyms, flexible working policies, parking, etc. Now we're going to look, well, that was a quick roundup really of some of the stakeholders that you'd like to engage with, and we've looked at some of the questions that you're going to ask them. When it comes to HR, with all this information that they potentially have, it's worth having, again, a little process, and we've got a slide here that talks about the organisations, people and staff, who's contracted, who's external, what their policies are on visitors and guests, where they have special spaces. This is your parking or your stores and warehouses. And then you want to work and talk with them and say, from their perspective, in their stakeholder engagements within the organisations and their specialist knowledge, what does the future, again, currently 3 years, 5 years time, etc. And you want to be looking at all this information because you're going to be doing a lot of headcount profiling, which might look like. Something like this, if you're looking at numbers in the organisation, what parts of the organisation against future, against time, years we've got at the bottom there. Or you might, and probably both, you'll be expressing this as a property forecast. What, in terms of square meterage around the globe, will you need in order to accommodate all those different categories of people who need to occupy or use or visit property? Finally then, finance. Your strategy needs to be economically viable and right for the business, of course, and any financial implications will have been or need to be approved by finance. So your strategy will need to outline a series of options with a sensitivity analysis looking at different scenarios of each. These will show the cost and the benefits of each option adjusted for a variety of outcomes. Capital expenditure, that's your lump sums spent on fit-out improvements, etc., buying property, will be treated differently from revenue spending on lease payments, wages, salaries, etc. Releasing capital by selling a building or freeing up revenue from an existing lease, from exiting a lease, may well end up in a different financial pot, and your strategy should indicate and define these financial outcomes. So you need to understand how it is that the finance department talk to the corporate function within your organisation, and you need to mirror that in your report. So your discussions with the finance department will also be focused on identifying which departments in the organisation have requested budgets and for what. Spending, capital expenditure. And of course you can cross-refer this information with what you discover at your stakeholder meetings, or use as a prompt if you've seen them before, your stakeholders, for those meetings. Now, we've met with all the stakeholders and we've gathered all the information. Now we've got to do something with it. We're going to analyse it. Let's say now you've concluded your consultation and you want to look at what your findings reveal. Some examples might be, are all your offices in Europe when you know that your organisation wants to grow in China? Are some of your buildings so obsolete that they're at risk of damaging the brand? And you know from your corporate stakeholder meetings that brand is more important than anything else. How different is the current supply of real estate to the anticipated changes? You've got departments who want to grow threefold in the next year. What's in the pipeline to be able to accommodate that? Why do some departments occupy 10 square metres per workstations while others seem to enjoy 20 metres squared? Why is it that some buildings emit twice as much CO2 as others? I certainly found that. Working in a local authority, we found a building that's CO2 rating was at least 2 or 3 times every other building. And under that criteria, we thought we'd close it down, but it was the town hall. So there's a political issue. How do your findings compare with your competition? Have you got benchmarking information from your competition? So your data analysis then is going to lead to creating some options to improve the current situation, bridge the gap between demand and supply, and meet the organisation's objectives. I'm going to give you a scenario here just to try and help with an example, as by way of an example. Let's say your organisation's objectives are to serve its diversely located clients better, reduce its overheads, and reduce its CO2 emissions. Your consultations have revealed it has an HQ, 40 satellite offices, say, a mixture of freehold and leasehold, many of which are underutilised and in poor state of repair. So you decide to create 3 options. One, which is often, or should always be the same, which is do nothing, that's the current status quo. 2, let's say you dispose of all 40 satellite offices and consolidate into one brand new huge central office, and you'll need to acquire it. And 3, third option is dispose of just some of the most inefficient satellite office space, keeping the better ones, keep the HQ, and introduce home working. So there's your options. First of all, you're going to be looking at this in terms of cost, each your options in terms of cost. And then you're going to look at it in terms of quality, and then you're going to look at it in terms of risk. Let's start off by cost, by which we mean financial impact of your option. The tool of choice here is a discounted cash flow spreadsheet, which, for those who don't know, is a series of future income and expenditure to which we apply a discount so that the sum is expressed in today's terms. We need to consider then the financial impact of each option in terms of your revenue expenditure. So does your option require you to take a new lease that you have to spend revenue on? Okay, revenue cost. Perhaps there's some sublease income to come in. Your capital cost. Do you have to expend capital money on works, fit out, buying buildings, etc.? Does your option include any receipts from disposal of property? And then you compare the results. Let's say that financially option 1, which is do nothing, puts the organisation in the worst financial position. But option 2, dispose of everything and acquire a new central HQ, is the best option from a financial perspective. This doesn't mean, however, we immediately recommend option 2, because we have other criteria than financial implications to consider. We're now going to go and score each option in terms of quality and risk. Quality. We need to produce a number of scoring options weighted to reflect the importance of each criterion to the organisation. So for example, you might have CO2 emissions as a criterion weighted at 10%, ability to serve customers at 60%, future flexibility of organisation because it's growing at 30% important, say. Imagine scoring my options against these criteria. Let's say that the option that made the most financial sense scored well on reducing CO2, got rid of all the buildings, but really badly on its ability to serve customers because you've got rid of buildings and they were in the very areas all the customers were, and now you've got rid of them, so it scores badly. And let's say it provides no flexibility for future expansion because you've got rid of all your buildings and you'd have to go and source from scratch new buildings, and let's say that's in an area where that's difficult to do. Option 3, although more expensive than option 2, might score very highly here, which is to keep some and have home working and fit out your HQ. You could apply the same, or you must apply the same exercise to risk. The definition of risk is uncertainty, really. That can be good uncertainty or bad uncertainty. Just uncertainty. Each option's risks then are evaluated. Criteria here may include asking what is the risk of certain site being available to enable your option to happen, or what is the risk of the timescale becoming unreasonable, etc. Great option, really not going to happen in reality. I'm sure you get the idea. We'll be looking at this in much closer detail in our advanced session. So once you've evaluated each option, you're in a position to explain your findings to the board and make appropriate evidence-based recommendations. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of the discussion and alignment with a range of organisational functions and what you do with the data afterwards. You analyse it, make a recommendation, and everybody's happy. Well, I thought I'd take a real live example. A close friend of mine happens to have a senior position within real estate for a very well-known pharmaceutical company. And this, I believe, hasn't yet gone to the board, so you're actually getting it before them, which is why I've anonymised the slides. But it's interesting to have a look. It showed me what's in their report in terms of the headings. I didn't get to look at all the detail. So, their main headings. They have a core strategic theme. They explain what they're basically trying to achieve from their property strategy. And they have a whole section on alignment with their core objectives, as we talked about earlier. They're very keen on transformation opportunities, so cultural change within the organisation. Can property support that? Supporting brand and identity, very well-known organisation. How does property do that? Of course, they lay out their key financial information, which in their case is very straightforward. It's their current real estate cost base, how much it costs per year, why the portfolio doesn't meet the optimum requirements, so in other words, the gap or the delta between the demand and supply, the cost savings identified by their options, which they show as a percentage reduction in run rate, non-financial benefits, staff retention. They don't do productivity, though they could do. Very difficult one to prove that, but there's plenty of studies on that. It's worth having a look into. They set out their options, their sensitivity around those options, and importantly, they explain exactly how they're going to do it, the step changes required to achieve their outcomes. And when's this all going to happen? Which stakeholders are required for approval? And they write all this in the context of the benchmarking against a couple of their competitors, of which they had some very good information. One of the things that we promise you in these webinar sessions is to look at some of the issues, because of course things aren't necessarily as straightforward as it might sound on a quick canter through the topic. So we put together some issues you might encounter when trying to put together your property strategy and having your engagement with your stakeholders. So, first of all, departments may not explicitly know where they want to be in 3 to 5 years' time, and we mentioned that earlier, and it really takes a while to have a conversation about, okay, if you can't say 3 years, what about 2 years, and try and build a picture of where you're going. You'll find that departments know a lot more than originally that they're going to let you know. You may not have explicitly thought about it for a while. Data. Never been into an organisation that has clean or clear or available data in one form. It's often in 7 different areas, in written format, in Excel spreadsheets. It will be with the HR department, the property department. It's going to be difficult, and you may have to expend some money on trying to get that data. It won't necessarily be accurate when you get it, so you'll need to do an audit of the data. You'll find that there will be some pushback. Not everybody wants to engage. You see the property guy coming and they will say, oops, we're going to lose some space. We like working out of this prime central London office, this historic building. We're frightened that we might lose that, therefore we're not going to engage. So you have to be very clear on your authority to be undertaking this exercise. Prepare, the pharmaceutical company I talked about, they've been working on that for 9 or 10 months. Expect to communicate to the board using their language. By that we mean that not everybody is a property person. They understand that we're talking about the implication of property and how it supports the functions and the future of the organisation. But when you're talking about the Landlord and Tenant Act 1954 Part 2, or you're talking about dilapidations, be careful that you don't alienate your audience. Recognise too, you might not have all the expertise in your current team. Engage with others who do have that expertise, consultants or others in the know. Strategic partners, this is what we've got here. Don't forget your strategic partners. They're often organisations that are working closely with the organisations, and in some cases, particularly the public sector, and particularly if you're a local authority, you'll find that a range of stakeholders, the police, etc., might be occupying your buildings, and in many cases you're responsible for paying for the building, but it may not be explicit in their terms of engagement and why they're operating. So you have to have a real understanding of that, and don't overlook buildings that don't have your staff in it just because they're not your staff. It's still an impact on your strategy. Don't necessarily expect property to be at the top of the agenda. That probably won't come as a surprise to you if you're an in-house property team. Property is getting better understood as we go through the years, but at the same time, it's not always at the top. That pharmaceutical company I was telling you about, they spend about £600 million a year on real estate, which is an awful lot of money. But they also spend $20 billion on other things, research and development, people, salaries, and therefore in the context of that, property is not the top of the agenda. And finally, you're not likely to get everything that you want to implemented, but as a professional you're going to gather the best strategy that you possibly can based on the best evidence. Well, if you found that interesting, and we will be looking at this in further detail, as I say, in our advanced sessions. If you have any questions associated with this presentation, or indeed want to get in touch, please visit the Coretex website, and you'll also find details of future webinars. The next one is due on the 11th of April at 4:30, and we'll be talking about managing the reduction of property portfolio. Thank you very much for listening.